Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the California State Library's Government Publications section for a California 175 program on Henry Cowell Redwood State Park with Tim Hyland from the California State Parks. My name is Catherine Wessenfeld, and I am the host of today's event. I'm a librarian with the Government Publications section here at the California State Library. Our moderator today is Bradley Siebold. He is also a librarian in the Government Publications section. He will be monitoring our Q&A section for any questions you may have. Sorry about that. We'll read your questions during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And the California State Library is thrilled to partner with the California State Parks to present today's program. And before we start, I have a bit of housekeeping to take care of. If you have any questions during our presentation, please type them into the Q&A box. We will answer them at the end of the program. This presentation will be recorded and made available on the California State Library's YouTube channel. We will email the link to everyone who registered. Live transcription is enabled. And please click on the CC icon to show the captions. If you run into technical difficulties, please put your requests into our Q&A box, and we will do our best to troubleshoot your technical difficulties. We have added links to the California State Library and the California State Parks in the chat window. For any state employees without a library card, please consider applying through the online application link. Our speaker today is Senior Environmental Scientist for the Santa Cruz District and a 30-year park veteran. His work includes managing invasive plants and protecting rare and endangered plant and animal species. It has also involved reintroducing prescribed fire into a variety of plant communities suffering from its absence. Please join me in welcoming Tim Hyland.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tim Hyland, the Natural Resource Program Manager here in the Santa Cruz District of California State Parks, and it's my pleasure to talk to you today about the fire ecology of coast redwoods. The first thing I want to do is get some kind of definitions out of the way. You know, what is fire ecology? If that's what I'm talking about, it seems like everybody ought to be on the same page. We've got a train yard near us, so you're going to get that as ambient noise. Fire ecology is just a plant community's relationship, plant community or plant species relationship with fire. And so why would we bother talking about a plant community's relationship with fire? Especially here on the Central Coast where it's cool and kind of wet. Well, it's because almost all of California experiences what we call a Mediterranean climate. That means we have relatively cool, wet winters, and we have warm, dry summers. Those cool, wet winters provide moisture for plants to grow, and then those warm, dry summers provide an opportunity for that vegetation to then become fuel for fires. There's another piece of that is the reason that we have that fuel is because when things rot most quickly, so decomposition occurs in plant material most quickly when you have warm, wet conditions. And if you remember what I just said about our climate, and you've probably lived here and know what it's like, is it's rarely warm and wet. It is almost always either cool and wet or warm and dry. So because of that, fire is an integral part of almost all of the plant communities in the state of California. And when we talk about fire in plant communities, we usually refer to it in terms of a fire regime, a particular regime of fire in a given plant community. So a fire regime has multiple components. It has frequency, intensity, seasonality, kind of size, and also duration. I'm going to go through each one of those kind of quickly and give some examples about different plant communities that experience differences in those. So frequency is the thing that most people focus on when we talk about a fire regime. It's just how often does it burn? You know, does it burn every year? Does it burn once a century? And so the plant communities with the most frequent fire are our grasslands. Those communities without relatively frequent fire on the 3 to 5 year time scale give way to woody plants that then grow up and shade them out. If you go to the other end of frequency, you go to our deserts, which are not really adapted to fire almost at all, and maybe have small fires there once every 100, 120 years. Some of our chaparral as well in Southern California has a fire frequency that is less, between 100 and 200 years. So something that burns really relatively infrequently. As far as intensity goes, how big are the flames? How much impact does it have on the vegetation? There's actually intensity and severity. I'm not going to distinguish between those two. I know they exist, but it gets a little confusing because typically the higher the intensity of the fire, the greater the severity on the plant community. So you can have low intensity fire, you can have mixed intensity fire in a plant community, you can have high intensity fire. Once again, to talk about these two communities on either end of that scale, grasslands are relatively, in sparser grasslands, you have relatively low intensity fire. And in shrublands, you have high intensity fire. So great big flame lengths, walls of flames, that sort of thing. In many forest types, you also have, if you have frequent fire, it's low intensity fire. And then seasonality. For the most part in California, things burn when it's dry. And that means we're entering, what we consider fire season right now. We have several large fires have already happened. And fire season spans a relatively broad period of time because our state is so large and so diverse. So, Northern California is still relatively wet, and Southern California is really very dry and entering a kind of a period of hazard for wildfire. And then extent is just how big fires, and I think in this instance, how big fires used to get prior to Euro-American arrival here. And fires used to be they got a whole lot bigger than they do now. I mean, we work pretty hard to keep them small. And fire can linger in fuels over a winter. So there were instances of, in the Southwest, really, thousands of miles expanse of fires, and in the North Coast, relatively large fires as well. You have a history in Southern Coast chaparral, actually, of relatively small fires, lots of them, but relatively small. So all of those things shape the plant communities that are interacting with them. And they shape them really significantly. If you change a single element, typically in a plant community, you change the plant community and the composition of that plant community. Like I said earlier, we have the example of our grasslands, and without fire, at least here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, if you remove fire, or some other form of disturbance from our grasslands, they turn into oak woodlands and then mixed evergreen forest over the course of between 10 and 30 years, really, really quite rapidly. Right here in Henry Cowell, we have a small grassland that was a grassland when I started working and is now a kind of mixed evergreen forest. And so that's 30 years it took to go from just not a single shrub in it to a forest. So that's pretty fast when you're talking about plant communities and their changes. We also, in the Eastern Sierra, we see an increase in fire frequency where you have invasive annual grasses providing fuel so that fires are occurring in that high desert scrub much more frequently than they used to. And once a fire runs through there and runs through there a couple of times, it turns it into a grassland, from a shrubland into a grassland. So you change the frequency and you change the plant community. And that's kind of the given wisdom about almost all plant communities in California and pretty much around the world. One exception to that is our coast redwoods. They're remarkable in their range of fire regimes under which they can persist and even thrive. Once redwoods have established in an area, they can happily persist with a fire once every 7 to 12 years, a low intensity fire once every 7 to 12 years. Or in Northern California, there are stands of redwoods that there's very little evidence of any fire, and quite a few that have only burned once every 300 years or so. So what's up with that? Why are redwoods so adaptable as far as that goes? They have, they're well known for their fire resistance, right? So they have, I will get some. Very thick, shreddy bark that squirrels actually strip off of the trees and use for their nests. The reason they do that is because it's very fluffy and very insulative. So when a fire comes through, that bark actually protects the cambium, that living layer of the tree, from the heat getting there and killing the cambium. So that is one adaptation that they have. They also, and we'll go to the screen here, if that's for a low severity fire, if you have a high intensity, high severity fire, then, yeah, there we are. Then redwoods, after, this is a picture from Big Basin Redwood State Park, 5 years after the CZU complex fire, which was a very high intensity, high severity fire. And you can see that it has really affected the canopy of these trees, but you also see there, especially on, I don't know whether it's the left or the right of your screen, it's the left of mine, you see that the redwoods are kind of doing this bottle brush thing. They're actually branching out from all the way along their trunks and also from their limbs. And while this isn't super uncommon in broadleaf or hardwood plants like oaks and, well, mostly oaks when I think about it, it is really uncommon amongst conifers, which redwoods are. So you don't see this except in redwoods, and then also in big cone Douglas fir is the only other conifer species that I know of that actually resprouts like this. And one of the super cool things about that is that these trees are actually tapping into energy that they stored as much as 60 years ago, and likely even longer, to regrow. Because if you think about tree and its relationship to its canopy, to its leaves, those leaves are its food factories, right? They are what is generating the energy needed to grow. So after a high severity fire, when all of those needles are gone, you know, imagine you just had no access to food at all. We wouldn't last very long. Use your fat stores as long as you could. Well, that's kind of what these trees are doing, is they're using this carbon that they have stored and pushing that out into these buds to regrow their canopy, and so that they can start photosynthesizing again and start growing again. But their first priority is to go ahead and get some leaves out there so that they can continue growing and living. So that's kind of one of the most surprising things for a conifer that they have. They also, and I can have, I'm gonna walk over here. You can actually, I'll just point that the redwood behind me here has clearly seen fire. It's been a long time since it saw fire, but you can see the black fire scar on it. And also you can see actually on that tree, if you were to get up against it and look up, that it's indented because the cambium was actually killed there during that fire. And so it wasn't able to grow in that section, but it is completely closed over. And redwoods are very good at repairing any damage that they do suffer from fire. And that damage to the individual tree, while it's unfortunate for that tree, is actually one of the kind of cool things that fire does in redwood forest, is it creates complexity in the forest. So, like I was saying about redwoods, they can survive and even thrive with frequent low intensity fire. That is what they experienced for much of their evolutionary history. Once humans showed up in North America, you see an increase in fire, and the redwoods are perfectly happy with that. But and then on the other end, they, as I said, in Northern California, they actually have very little fire. But this is something also that I think is kind of interesting. It's widely known that redwoods harvest water from fog during the summer. They get a huge amount of their water. You know, we live in California. It doesn't rain in the summer, right? But they are thirsty trees. They're great big trees with great big canopies. And one of the ways they are able to do that is by actually harvesting fog, turning it into rain, turning it into fog drip, and dripping it on their roots. And so that will get them through these dry summers. But you would think if, you know, and so if you think about the southern extent of their range, they kind of peter out just a little down in Monterey County in Big Sur. That's the southernmost extent of the coast redwood range. And that's likely a combination of a couple of things, perhaps fire frequency and intensity, and perhaps drought, and just how much fog you get. Well, then on the northern end of their range, here in Santa Cruz County, all of the biggest trees, and this is the case all throughout the range, are down in deep alluvial soils, in the wettest, best growing grounds. And so they love water. You can hardly give a redwood too much water. So then that is a bit of a puzzle. Why then don't they grow further north? Why don't they grow into Oregon, into Washington, up into Canada and Alaska, if what they really are looking for is more water? Well, one thing that is absent up there is fire, and fire at the frequency that they see here. This is, correlation, not causation. We haven't, nobody's proved that, but it is interesting to think that these trees are limited not just by fog, but by fire. So I like to think of them, as trees of fog and fire. They need both that fog to wet their roots in the summer, and then they need that fire to reduce the competition with other faster growing trees. Redwoods grow fast, but they invest a lot in protecting themselves and enduring. So they produce things called sesquiterpenes, and there's a reason that redwoods are valued as lumber because of their rot resistance. Well, that doesn't come for free. When a tree puts energy into that, it takes away from the speed of their growth. So the trees to the north, where you don't have redwoods, you then have Sitka spruce and you have Douglas fir, both of which are sensitive to fire, but grow faster than redwoods do. So it's this interplay of individual trees don't need fire, but as a species, they are adapted to it. And so I said earlier that redwoods are resistant to fire and well known for that, but less well known, they're also spreaders of fire. Like, they actually encourage fire. And that's not widely thought of. People mostly think of how they resist fire. Our relationship with fire for the last 150 years has been fire's bad and we try and put it out. And so redwoods are awesome because they can resist fire, but they also are a very flammable tree. So I'm going to just do a little demonstration of redwood needles burning. And full disclosure, to get them going, I actually need a little bit of wax, but once they get going, we should see how they burn. Just a sec, I'll get them started here. Normally when I'm doing this, I'm doing it with a drip torch, which is full of a mix of diesel and gasoline. And so that gets things going pretty well. That's why I'm opting for a little bit of wax here. You can't see this here. Let me see. We'll just see whether they go or not. Maybe they're not gonna today. One more try. Let's see if we can make them, if we can get them started. If we can get them started, they will, you'll get a sense of what a redwood forest looks like when it's burning, which is kind of pretty mellow. I don't think that's gonna go today. I think I'll, turns out they need a little more umph, so you'll have to take it on faith that they actually are quite flammable. When we burn grasslands, the grass is the first thing that becomes available, and the next thing that becomes available are actually the redwood needles. So we have to be careful when we're burning around redwoods. So I already mentioned that their fire is part of a redwood ecosystem, and some of the things that it does that you can't do mechanically is it creates this complexity of fire scars, like I pointed out there. If that tree had seen several more fires in short order, even at a decadal scale, then likely it would have developed what they call a cat face, which is, a cavity in it. Those cavities are used by bats and birds, and of some trees, eventually the cavity goes all the way to the top and they become chimney trees. They're still alive because that cambium is alive on the outside, but those trees then become hollowed out, and those are the homes for chimney swifts. You think about the evolutionary interplay with a bird that is adapted to basically only land by hanging when it nests. The rest of its life, it spends in the air. The only reason that they come to perch is you can't lay eggs in the air. It doesn't work. Although they're called chimney swifts because they will nest in chimneys, they existed before anybody built the chimney. So these were the chimneys that they nested in. They nested in redwood chimney trees. And that's the sort of thing that you can't duplicate with any other sort of management. That doesn't, thinning or fuel reduction or any of those sorts of things doesn't result in that sort of micro complexity that you get from tree to tree to tree. But as long as we're talking about management, I am going to swing over here. Here we are. And talk about some of what we're doing here at Henry Cowell. That is not an art piece back there, although it kind of is. The lighting's even good enough for it right now. But that is a burn pile that was created by our volunteers here at Henry Cowell. And they came to me and were concerned after the CZU fire and what happened in Big Basin, that same thing could happen here to their beloved old growth trees. And they wanted to do something about it. Well, it's very hard to burn in old growth forests where you have parking lots and visitor centers and a whole lot of split rail fences and all of the sorts of things that we love to put in place to make it comfortable for people to come to the redwoods and see them, just like get right down into the heart of them. Doing what we call a broadcast burn, which is to say putting fire on the ground and letting it work through the needles and into the trees, is really, really challenging. And inevitably ends up in some of these trees burning down, right? They can live for almost, here we have some getting close to 2,000 years old, but with enough repeated fire, that's pretty much what kills an old growth redwood is fire. So individuals can be harmed, but the forest overall benefits from that fire. But once you've narrowed it down, we have less than 1% of coast redwood forests that have never been cut down. So we're really dealing with a tiny, tiny scrap of what's left of our redwoods. And so burning any of them down is, questionable decision. It's kind of not something that we want to do. So getting in here and creating these burn piles allows us to reduce the fuels in this redwood grove. And then in the winter, we'll come back, we'll put tarps on that, it'll rain, we'll scratch a line around it, and we're able to go ahead and burn those piles and reduce those fuels so that when we get another crazy event like the CZU, that these trees are not exposed to the amount of fuels that were present in Big Basin. In Big Basin, we did broadcast burning around our old growth and burned hundreds of acres around it. But as many of you know, if you're trying to protect a structure or anything from fire, you actually want to start at the structure. You want to start at the old growth. And we didn't have the capacity then to do that, so we tried to reduce fuels in the vicinity. But what is more effective is to reduce fuels immediately adjacent to those old growth redwood trees. And I think with that, I will leave it and open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. That was a fantastic presentation. Now we are, as Tim said, going to open it up for questions. If you have questions for Tim, please type them in the Q&A box. Bradley, did we have any questions that came in during Tim's presentation?
Yes, we did. Thank you, Catherine. And Mr. Hyland, that was really enlightening. I really enjoyed your presentation. And I think, yeah, the coastal redwoods are among my, favorite California trees. So I think we had a number of questions that came in. Somebody had a question about how deep the root system is for, the coastal redwoods
Yeah, and
are.
that's it's always curious. We can't see underground, but we do see when these trees topple, as they do sometimes in the wind, that they don't have a particularly deep root system. They roots on almost all trees follow there has to be oxygen and there has to be water, and they will grow wherever there's oxygen and water. They'll grow up, they'll grow sideways, they'll grow down. And since redwoods are harvesting that water in the summer from their fog drip, they've got to have feeder roots to actually suck that in. They also have anchoring roots that are somewhat deeper, but they're not, I'm thinking of a mesquite tree in the desert that can go 40 feet down to get water. That's not the system we've got here, right? The water's mostly on the surface. Now, redwoods in floodplains can actually develop tiered root systems where they will have roots, they'll get buried by a flood, and they'll make another set of roots, and you can actually have multiple tiers of roots on these trees because they still need that oxygen, and those ones down at the bottom are not don't have that much available. So they're very plastic as far as that goes because they do grow in these alluvial plains that see some pretty significant flooding.
Great, thank you. And is it true that they combine different, uh, coast redwoods, they combine their roots
Yeah,
to
yes,
form a.
yes, they actually will graft with other trees, and there's evidence of that for lots of different tree species, but absolutely redwoods do. So that's another way they hold each other up, is they kind of all support each other.
Right. Thank you. Another question that came in was of a historical nature. You mentioned in the beginning of your talk about like fires being larger before colonialization. Do we know that from down trees, or how do we know that knowledge from?
Yeah. So we get that from tree cores and from uh, down trees that we also are able to kind of cut slabs out of. And I have a tree core on my desk that has evidence of a fire from the 1670s. And that fire shows up in tree cores throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so that was certainly large and probably a high severity fire as well, because these things don't show up unless they actually reach the cambium of the tree, right? So if they were low severity and they just kind of punked around the bark, you'd see no evidence of it. Now, once a tree has been damaged, if another fire happens, that tree then has become a sensitive tree, and it actually becomes a good marker because the fire gets in there and you can see all of the fires for many years. This particular core showed several other fires, but that was the most notable one to me just because it occurred prior to Euro-American colonization. So these very large fires were happening prior to that time.
Yeah, and a follow-up, I know you also mentioned that like fire science ha has changed over the decades and centuries. And do we know if Native Americans also instituted like prescribed burns in their environments?
Well, they were managed. There's good evidence that as soon as humans show up, that there's a lot more fire. So that's in sediments from lagoons and soil cores from that. You also see it. They were managing their landscape, and fire was one of the most powerful tools that they had to do it. There's a wonderful book by M. Cat Anderson called Tending the Wild, and in it she shows how many different shrubs you would need to make a basket. And California Indians made amazing baskets, still do, but they required long, straight shoots from plants, and they needed thousands of them. And it turns out that if you don't burn these plants and get them to regenerate, then you really couldn't feasibly do what they had done. So there's several lines of evidence that show that they were using fire for different reasons in the environment, and they were using it very specifically. There's also a really great story map about fire use by Aboriginal peoples in Australia that shows how specific their use of fire was, because they were taken off the land when we had the first aerial photography, and you could actually see the shapes of the fires that they were burning. And so this wasn't something where they lit a fire and went, well, I hope that works. This was very much tending a particular shrub, say, or a patch of shrubs or a patch of trees to manage that for a particular reason. They used fire to reduce the prevalence of acorn weevils in their acorns by reducing the litter under tan oaks. But tan oaks are very sensitive to fire. So if you were going to light a fire around a tan oak, then you would also have to take care of your trees. So it was very intentional and extremely explicit. And they did manage these grasslands at large scales, so that grasslands were much more prevalent in the Coast Ranges under the management of native peoples.
Great, that's a fantastic answer. Thank you. I know with climate change and everything, fires are changing. Is there a good time or a best time for people to visit the park, seasonally or anytime, or what is your favorite
It's a
season?
different park on any given day. I mean, one of the nice things about a Redwood park is that the Redwoods kind of make their own environment. So it tends to be a very pleasant place for humans to be, because on hot days, they're cooling things off. On windy days, they're kind of sheltering you. Yeah, I mean, on drippy, wet days, it's just kind of fun. There's more banana slugs. So yeah, I don't know if there's a best time.
Okay. Yeah, you spoke a little bit about, them absorbing fog to get water. Do they also absorb like environmental pollutants, or could you tell that from a core sample, or
I will
do we
just have
know?
to plead ignorance on that. I have my suspicions, but it would be wild conjecture. So I think I'll leave it.
Sure, sure thing. Is there like a time frame, or what makes this like an old growth instead of like a new growth or second growth?
That's an excellent question, because I always refer to old growth. Virgin forest is another thing. And there are characteristics of older trees. They develop large platy bark. They get more, their canopies become more complex. An old growth tree is really just time plus insult and injury, and you get sort of that complexity. And so if it's never been cut, it's an old growth. So I suppose that, kind of, if I was asking that question, the follow-on question I'd ask is, when does the stuff that's been cut, when does it become old growth? And it will continue to develop characteristics of old growth forests for the next 1,000 years. You know, I think a 500-year-old tree and a forest that hasn't been cut in a few hundred years is going to look a whole lot like some of our residual forests now, but it is a crazy time scale that these trees function on. And I do remember being in one of our parks and looking at a stand of second growth redwoods with a forester and kind of trying to decide if there was something that we could do that would improve the resilience or do something. And I kind of was like, well, it just seems like we got to wait 1,000 years. And he said, you know, give it a couple hundred, it's going to be shaping up pretty good. So.
Great. That's yeah, that's amazing. We have a follow-up question. You talked about the insulative properties that these redwoods have. Do the roots also have a protective layer, or is that just the soil itself? Or
that's the soil. Happily for trees and all sorts of stuff, heat goes up and soil is insulative. So between those two things, unless you have fire sitting in a spot for a very long time, you don't have that much of an impact very far down at all. So yeah, so the roots are not typically particularly susceptible or, you know, not significant. I shouldn't say that. They, as I said earlier, roots will go wherever there's oxygen and water. So redwood roots, since redwoods can create duff that's, you know, 2 feet thick and, you know, frequently 16 inches thick, they have roots in there because it's like a big sponge. And so that was something that we saw with the CZU fire, where all of that was erased, basically. All of that organic material was erased. So they had significant negative impacts to their roots. At the same time, though, they lost their canopy. And while the canopy makes them food, it also requires water. So their water requirements went down significantly. At the same time, their root systems were significantly impacted. So that's kind of worked out, you know, so you didn't see a lot of mortality from the root death because they weren't having to support these great canopies. And so you didn't see a tree whose canopy hadn't been scorched then lose all its needles because its roots had been removed. It kind of, if it was hot enough to cook all the roots, it also cooked the canopy.
great, thank you. We have a technical question about like controlled burns. Do you like count like the cones or like the seeds like before and after, or is there do you list the burns that you're gonna do on your website, or is there a like every week, or is there a schedule for prescribed burns? Or
we do our very best to and we've been really improving as far as letting folks know what we're up to as far as burning, you know, makes people nervous for good reason, and also, you know, the just general interest. But burning is, you know, we call it prescribed burning because there's a prescription. So that prescription has to do with environmental factors. So basically it has to do with the weather. And so we are only able to safely burn under a narrow parameters of humidity, wind, temperature, fuel moisture. And so you can imagine you have to get all of your resources to do this work and line them all up. And then it just depends on whether the weather window opens. So what we do on our website is we have a calendar that says we're going to try and burn in this window. Maybe it's 2-3 weeks. And then we will update as we get closer, whether it happened or whether it's not going to happen, or yeah. So you have to be very flexible to do prescribed burning, especially since we tend to do it on the cooler end when it's wetter. And So yeah, our prescription is very narrow.
Great, thank you. We had a follow-up about soil and roots. Do the fires, maybe the severity of the fire changes this, but does it affect like the quality of the soil or for the trees themselves or
Well, it does, like I said, their litter, that the soils have various horizons. The top is the A horizon, but then there's the O horizon, which is the organic material. And so that's been basically erased. And that was, useful. They had their roots in there, they were growing in it. Having that sponge sitting there was helpful. But like I said, they've been through this before. The forest is drier because not only is that sponge removed, but the canopy is removed, so you have a lot more sun. So I think that the trees themselves are going to be a little happier once they get a little more shade and they get a little more canopy and they get a little more organic material that shades the soil and retains the moisture. But you see in those tree rings, you can see how fast they grow by how wide they are. And following fires, typically those rings get significantly wider because they don't have the competition with everything else. So that kind of balances out any impacts to the characteristics of the environment, or it has in the past. That's one of the ways you'll see a fire scar, which is a little dark line, and then you'll see these great big growth rings, and the trees are just like, awesome, we're ready to go. You also have nitrogen that gets deposited in the soil when there's a fire, especially a hot fire. And in this instance, following this fire, you have nitrogen fixing plants that move in and come in behind a fire. So they're getting actually more nutrients than they would before the fire.
Great, thank you. We have another question. It's about like what can we do as patrons to state parks to like help reduce fire hazards? I know you mentioned you have volunteers that came to you and talked about burning. Is there anything else that we can do as like citizen scientists or as patrons of state parks?
Yeah. I suppose when you're here, be careful with fire when you're here. That's always fire safety kind of number one. Volunteering is awesome. Educating yourself, about fire and fire ecology, I think, so that you understand kind of more what these systems need and what they evolved with. Yeah, I don't know. I think you could join any of our supporting organizations. We have lots of folks who help us out in a lot of different ways. And there are. I mean, if you're really interested in fire, you could join a local prescribed burn association, and we partner with them, and they come out and help us do burns. So
Great, thank you. Yeah. We're getting even more and more questions because you're so great at answering them. So, but what is the elevation of Henry Cowell Redwoods State Park? Is it high in the Santa Cruz Mountains or is it?
Lean on my inter people if they know. Are we at like less than 800? I was going to say 800 feet, so right, a little under 800 feet. So yeah, not
Right.
super high, not super low. For the Santa Cruz Mountains, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we know, and you mentioned that complex fire that happened at Big Basin. Do we know how many acres or how many trees were affected by that?
We've
that
got
complex fire?
we have a Reimagining Big Basin website that has a link to our forest management strategy. that has some really in-depth, in the weeds information about tree mortality and yeah, the impact of that fire on that park. So that's where I would steer you. I'd have to go look at it myself to answer that question. So.
Great, thank you. And we have just like some questions about how tall coastal redwoods get and how old they get. Is there average height or average age in Henry Cowell's or just more generally in the
Yeah, I
community of
mean,
coastal redwoods?
a 300-foot plus redwood is a tall redwood. We have some of those in Buteno. I don't think we have any here in Henry Cowell. And then aging trees, unless you core them, is kind of a fool's game. So until they fall down, we mostly don't know how old they are because they're so large, but over 1,000 years old. I just kind of stop there. Anything from my interp folks, leave it there. Okay.
Right. I know you mentioned that we have a small percentage. The range has decreased throughout the years. How much has it decreased in the last,
Well,
is
I
it?
don't know that the redwoods themselves, redwood forest has not decreased in its range. The amount that hasn't been cut down is 1%. But redwoods still they're incredibly resilient once they're established. If you cut a redwood tree down, what you get is 6 more redwoods. Or 6 to 10 more redwoods. So for all of the timber harvest that happened at the turn of the century, what we mostly have is more trees in less space. And what we'd like to have is fewer trees in the same space. Because if you think about, if you do any gardening at all and you pack a bunch of carrots together, they don't grow as big until you thin them out. And so redwoods, now having been cut, have come back with more stems per acre, right? So there are more trunks in any given acre of land, and any given acre of land can only grow so much tree. So if you have 10 trees in an acre of land, they're going to grow bigger faster than if you have 100 trees in an acre of land. And what we have now is redwood forests have been through this fire regime before, but they never all been cut down like they were at the turn of the century. So we now have these forests that are starting to reestablish themselves so that they're starting to shade out and kind of self-select for kind of the winners and losers. But 100 years in a redwood forest lifespan is really nothing. So we're just starting to see these forests sort themselves out, and they're in a really vulnerable position with climate change, because the more trees you have per acre, if a fire runs through there, the more trees that will be killed by that fire. So now I've even lost where the question started, but
Yeah, no, that was great. And you showed some pictures of the canopy regrowing from that fire. Do we know how long that process takes from like a severe fire to them repairing themselves if possible, or what is the time frame on that?
I don't know if there's any scholarly literature on that, but my experience tells me that we're somewhere between, we're 5 years out from that fire, and looking at how they've regrown, I think that we're 15 to 20 years from kind of a closed canopy, the forest that we knew before the fire.
Okay. Look, we have just a few more minutes. Let me see what kind of questions we're getting. Looks like we have some questions about like, I know there's old growth and then like second growth. It, compared like second growth to old growth, like is there a great change in density of these forests or?
Yeah, typically. So that is typically if you cut a tree down, you get multiple sprouts. And but it depends on how it's managed. So, you know, in parkland, yes, there's significantly greater density in second growth forests. And so significantly more susceptibility to mortality in the event of another high severity fire. And that's something that is spelled out pretty clearly in that management plan that the forest management strategy that I mentioned earlier. It kind of goes into that in detail. So yeah, second growth forests tend to be a lot denser. And so that's something that State Parks is doing in the North Coast as part of Redwoods Rising, is going in and actually thinning those forests to allow those trees to put on more growth and more rapidly achieve the characteristics of an old growth forest.
Great. I have to thank you for all of your fantastic answers. I think we're out of time. I don't think we made it to all the questions. So if we didn't answer your question, we'll try to take it down and get back to Tim here to see if he has any additional answers for us. And I'll hand it back to you, Catherine. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Tim Hyland for his wonderful presentation. Thank you to Bradley Siebold for monitoring our Q&A and all our tech help in the background. And thank you all of you for attending. If you enjoyed this presentation, please register for our 2 additional webinars with the California State Parks. On September 17th, we'll be visiting Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park to learn about California salmon. And then on October 9th, we will be learning about watersheds and forest succession at Cuyamaca Rancho State Park. For more information on these webinars and other events at the State Library, please consider subscribing to our news and events newsletter. And if you're ever in the area, please visit the State Library at 914 Capitol Mall in Sacramento. We are open Monday through Friday from 9:30 to 4 p.m. And you can also send us questions via phone, email, or our Ask a Librarian web form on your homepage. Thank you all for being here and have a great afternoon.